I had been planning this road trip for a long time. Practically, I had been making plans for about 6 months, but the idea germinated in my mind long before that. I had been aware of motorcycle touring for quite a while. My parents had done it when they were younger, and I had realized just how far you could take this form of travel by watching TV shows like The Long Way Round, where Charlie Borman and Ewan McGregor traveled around the world on BMW 1200s. The burgeoning YouTube motorblogging community also fed the ideas in the back of my mind to do something like this myself. Having a limited amount of money to spend on motorcycle gear and on the motorcycle itself, I had assembled an ad hoc touring setup, all mounted on a sports bike that really wasn't meant to handle this amount of luggage. My previous several trips had all been experiments, testing out different setups and learning how to properly travel on a motorcycle. Luggage had always been a problem. In my other trips, I had never had enough space. To counter this, I had brought a bag that goes over the second seat of the motorcycle. This offered more space than soft panniers which I had used previously. But it also had the downside that a lot of the weight on the motorcycle was resting up high, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. The first night of my trip, I rode from Canberra to Batemans Bay, along a road colloquially known as the Clyde. The road itself is actually called the King's Highway, but it travels over the Clyde Mountain, hence the name. You can see it marked here on the map. The footage you've been watching for the past minute is footage that I took of that road. The road is highly regarded by Canberra motorcyclists because of the tight curves, scenic route, and the fact that it leads to Batemans Bay, which is a perfect place to spend a weekend if you live in Canberra. Here you can see some footage of the bridge that crosses over the Clyde River and leads into Batemans Bay. I stayed at a free camping spot about 10 kilometers outside of Batemans Bay. The campsite is actually fairly off-road, and I was lucky to get down a steep, unsealed road on my road bike. At the campsite, I met a few other serious adventure riders. Most of them had big 1200 off-road bikes that had proper luggage setups. One of the riders, a big guy who was also a professional motorcycle instructor, told me about his experiences in the Dakar Rally and gave me some suggestions for trips around Australia in the future. In particular, he mentioned the Strzelecki track, a road which heads north through the Strzelecki Desert in South Australia, north of the Flinders Ranges and east of Lake Eyre National Park. I filed that suggestion away for later. My first night in my tent was rather auspicious. It rained, and I quickly found that my tent was not waterproof. Apparently, tents need to be routinely waterproofed, and this tent was nearly 15 years old. The canvas was thick enough that it kept most of the water off me, but the tent was far from dry in the morning. After I packed up, I managed to scale the steep road out of the campsite in first gear, and then I was off. I rode down to Pambula to stay with relatives. After staying a night in Pambula, the next day proved to be rainy, so I decided to stay another night. The following day, I rode up the tourist drive along the coast. This road closely follows the coast, from Pambula to Tilba. I then took the inland road I had taken on the previous day and rode back down to Pambula and down to Malakuta. On the way there, I stopped at Ainslings Beach in Eden. I had brought a copy of Robinson Crusoe in Pambula, and I read the first few chapters while lying on the beach. There was a road that ran for a few kilometers right next to the beach, which was great because I could lie on the beach while still keeping an eye on my motorcycle and the luggage. Because all of my luggage is soft luggage, I have very little security when I was traveling, and I was constantly worried about being away from my motorcycle for too long. It would have been quite easy for someone to go through my luggage or just take a whole bag off the back of my bike. In addition, the bike was very top heavy, which made it particularly unstable. Most bikes with luggage often have saddlebags or panniers which distribute the weight lower down on the bike on each side, giving the motorcycle more stability. This was something I had been thinking about for a while and considering for the next motorcycle that I buy. The next day, rain was a constant problem. I had to spend a few hours sitting in a cafe waiting for heavy rain to die off so that I could keep traveling. As a result, I was not making good time. Despite the rain, I passed out of the Sapphire Coast and onto the south coast of Victoria. One of the problems that I found that I have as I've been editing this video is that I have such a colossal amount of footage, but I actually don't have a lot to talk about over the top of that footage. So for this reason, there are going to be large stretches of this video which are just footage and music. If you want to skip ahead to hear me talking again, you can go to about 23 minutes into this video. On the fourth day of travelling, I reached a town called Bairnsdale, on the south coast of Australia, east of Melbourne. This town is well known for the church there, which is decorated with beautiful murals. The murals were painted by Francesco Floriani, a young Italian man who had emigrated to Australia in 1927. Born in Venice, Francesco had studied painting at the Academy of Arts in Turin. In 1930, Francesco was picking fruit at Meetung, which is a town, for work, when he met Friar Kremen, who was the priest of the parish of Bairnsdale. When the friar learnt that Francesco was a trained artist, he offered him the job of painting the interior of the church at Bairnsdale. Francesco accepted the work. Overall, it took 4 years to complete the interior of the church. When I reached Bairnsdale, I had planned to continue along the coast to Melbourne and to visit Phillip Island, which is a small island off the coast of Australia and most famous for the Grand Prix racetrack which was built on the island. Visitors are allowed to actually use the track, but since it was so early in the year, the schedule for when these events were happening wasn't yet posted. When I got to Bairnsdale and I did some research, I found that the Grand Prix track on Phillip Island was not open to the public at present. Since this was my main reason for going to the island, I decided to take a look around and see what else I could find. In the Bairnsdale Visitors Centre, I found some pamphlets for motorcyclists which detailed fun and scenic roads to tour, including info on one road that I had never heard of before, the Great Alpine Road. The Great Alpine Road runs through the Snowy River National Park and mostly winds between valleys and mountains, but also crosses over the top of Mount Hotham, giving spectacular views of the mountains and surrounding scenery. The road ends at Wangaratta, and from there goes south through the King Valley, a beautiful golden wine region. Even though it was midsummer, the temperatures often dropped to 10 degrees at night and remained about 20 degrees during the day, which is quite low. The Great Alpine Road begins with about 150 kilometers of fierce mountain roads that constantly ascend. After you start, there are no petrol stations for another 150 kilometers. Since my motorcycle doesn't have a fuel gauge, the way I keep track of my fuel is to set the trip odometer on my motorcycle and watch how far I've traveled. Since I know I have a maximum of 350 kilometers of travel from a full tank, I always make sure to fill up my tank when necessary before I head out on a road without fuel stations for a significant amount of time. About 50 kilometers into the Great Alpine Road, I looked down at my odometer and nearly had a heart attack. The odometer read 320 kilometers, and I suddenly realized that I had another 100 kilometers until the next fuel station. I pulled over to the side of the road and considered my options. I thought back until the last time I refilled my tank, while trying to keep my heart rate down. The thought of spending a night on the side of a cold mountain where there was no room to pull off the road scared me a bit. I racked my brain, trying to think of the last time I had refueled, and realized that it was actually in the town about 100 kilometers ago. I couldn't have come more than 300 kilometers since then, so I must have forgotten to reset the odometer when I had filled up. I opened the fuel tank and checked the fuel. There was about 2/3 of it left. I took a few deep breaths and told myself that I was alright. I had avoided being stranded this time, but I made damn sure to keep a close eye on my odometer for the rest of the trip. I had found that after a few days of traveling, setting up my tent every night was incredibly tiresome. It was hard to be on the road before 10 a.m. sometimes, and I was frustrated by my lack of progress. I expected to be much further along the trip than I was. One of the hardest things I found while traveling on these road trips is just dealing with riding your bike for 10 or more hours a day. It's pretty rough. It's not exactly boring, but it can be hard because you have nothing to think about and your mind wanders quite a bit. One of my solutions to this problem was to listen to audiobooks and podcasts. On this trip, I brought with me a collection of short stories from George R.R. Martin. Listening to stories in this way gave me a really intense memory of both the places I was traveling and the stories I was listening to. I remember listening to stories like The Night Flyers while I was traveling through the King Valley, and In the Lost Lands while I was driving through Seymour, a town north of Melbourne. This kept me entertained while I was traveling and killed a lot of the boredom. I found the short stories work really well for creating these strong memories. Each story, which can be very different and vivid, can match and attach to a location. Because these stories and locations change often, these memories form strong connections. Even though traveling is exciting and interesting by itself, sometimes traveling through rural areas can be pretty tough. There isn't a huge amount of change in the scenery between New South Wales and South Australia, so it could get quite boring sometimes.